So everybody here that I promised beer earlier to come and see me, I kind of lied. But it works, obviously, because it's like packed room in here, so which is awesome. So the next two talks are going to be dealing with acoustic telemetry projects in dreaded Lake Erie that was said earlier here. And acoustic telemetry is a new technology, and Lake Erie is very invested in that, and it's really moved the bar much higher as far as being able to see some fine-scale movements. And in the case of our next talk on walleyes, it moves the management bar forward. In the talk I'm going to be presenting here on lake trout, it's moving our knowledge of our rehabilitation and trying to come to terms with why we're seeing reproductive failure in lake trout in Lake Erie. Thought it'd be nice to start off the story with a little bit of history here on the lake. Real quick, lake trout were the pinnacle predator in Lake Erie 150 years ago out there. Most people don't think that, but they were. With that, commercial fisheries began a long time ago, ramped up in the late 1800s. We had huge lake trout, over 50 inches, over 75 pounds, were in newspaper reports. So lake trout got really large in the lake, and frankly, they still do if they got that old. Most of the populations were in the east, where we have the summer cold water habitat. The central basin, not so much. There is some limited habitat there, but not compared to the east. Anecdotal reports of not summertime, all year round populations in the west basin, which is very shallow and warm, but spawning populations there, which were very common. We had big fish migrations from the east to the west. Lake whitefish and cisco at that time. Makes sense that maybe the lake trout were doing the same thing. Like all the other Great Lakes story, commercial fishing, poorly regulated in Lake Erie, in habitat loss, exotic species, and by the 1950s, majority of the populations disappeared, and total loss of stocks, lake trout extirpated by the mid-1960s. And of course, with everything that disappears, we quickly realize that we like it back, so we start stocking them again. And that happened just a few years after we declared them extirpated, back in 1969. But the real story began in 1982. We got committed annual stocking from Fish and Wildlife Service, varied, but about 200,000 yearlings a year. And then the other big part of that was sea lamprey control started in 1986. And those two things together really put an adult population that began in the early 1990s, and we still have today of various levels of abundance out there. Generated huge recreational fisheries at very small scale in Pennsylvania and New York. Really no targeted commercial fishery. And we see spawning activity is evident in Lake Erie. There is viable eggs that have been collected at points in time. However, we have seen no natural reproduction, which is where our acoustic telemetry project comes in. So we've kind of come full circle here a little bit here with that. So this started in 2015, really got on the road in 2016. And we have four main objectives, but the real one I want to talk about with the talk today with this is trying to identify potential spawning sites of lake trout in Lake Erie. So real quick slide or two on methods. We're just going to deal with fish that were tagged in 2016, 96 adults. They have a four-year plus battery life, so hopefully we'll be still picking up some of these fish back in 2020, 2021. Tagging was in eastern basin sites. I'll show you those in just a minute. But in various waters in the springtime, Maine, New York, Ontario, so mixed fisheries at that point in time. Tracking of these fish through an existing GLaDOS. Lake Erie is wired with a lot of receivers for various other projects in the lake, and we're taking advantage of those. But we also utilize some nearshore receivers that we'll put out around the East Basin, and I'll show you those in 1 minute as well too. So those are our tagging sites. up here. Oh, I hit the wrong one. See if we can get that back. There we go. Tagging sites: Ontario, Pennsylvania, off of a little to the east of Erie, PA, and then off of Dunkirk, where our office is here. 2 spots there, and then the white dots around here are acoustic receivers that were put out specifically for this project in the nearshore areas, about 30 feet of water ringing the lake, 5 miles apart. There was other acoustic receivers and arrays out in the lake, and those will show up in our graphics in a few minutes. For those of you not familiar with how acoustic telemetry works, there's our tagged lake trout over here. These are receivers that are sitting on the bottom of the lake. They have, depending on water clarity, there of maybe even over a mile radius of where they can detect a tag. Lake trout swims into that sort of sphere of detection of that, and that tag emits a signal every 2 minutes. If there's a receiver there within range, it picks it up, logs what tag it is, logs what time it is, so we know that that fish was right around that general area at that time. And then about every 6 months, sometimes up to a year, we pop off those receivers, they float to the surface, and the data is downloaded here. So we do have a data lag that happens with that. We have data from 2018. It's not in the system yet. What I'm going to be talking with today is data from mostly 2016 and then some data from 2017. So some preliminary results. So now we get into the fun stuff here. So we're going to play this video twice here too. So on the first go around, I want you to just pay attention to two things here. One is fall turnover. Here on October 23rd, and then the other is going to be what happens at spawning time, which are water temperatures that start at 50 degrees and go down here to about 42 degrees Fahrenheit. So let's watch this video once. The black dots are the receivers that are online at that point. The blue dots are going to be our tagged fish. So we have turnover is about now. Now we're coming into spawning, near spawning time. And then at the end. So we're going to play that over again. So a few things to notice. Obviously at turnover, this fish, some of them are moving near shore, but a lot of those fish are out deep where, but turnover comes, water temperatures drop. You immediately see a near shore movement of the fish, mainly to the south shore. So pay attention, one thing to pay attention to here is how many fish are on the north shore of the lake. You're not going to see very many. You see some, but not very many. Most of these fish are going to the south shore of the lake and making large and fast movements. They're covering a lot of ground every day. Buffalo to Erie, sometimes in a day or 2 days. They're very quickly in this intermediate time period between turnover and spawning. When spawning time comes, the movement kind of slows down a little bit, and you notice that a vast concentration of fish between Dunkirk, which is about right there, and Erie, Pennsylvania. There'll be fish scattered around, but the bulk of the fish end up right here. So let's play that one more time. So there's our movement out into the lake. Again, hanging offshore, water temperatures cooling. We get turnover, and there's the rapid movement. Big changes, lots of movement going on, and then starts to slow down when spawning time comes. And a lot of fish hold up in the one spot. But some in other spots as well too. Okay, so let's look at this is the same scenario for in 2017. One thing to pay attention to, Brian Lantry, is a couple of these fish end up in Lake Ontario. You'll see them scoot down the Niagara River and end up here. Yeah, so you hit this one. So again, this is the same thing. You got turnover happening there. There they go. We always like to help Lake Ontario out whenever we can. Shooting phosphorus down and other things, fish once in a while. So we don't have a complete data set from those back again, and that would be, but really very consistent results between those 2 years of what's going on, fish holing up in that same place. So one more video here. So this is going to be 2 individual fish here. You'll notice that one of them is not going to be on the screen, and then all of a sudden right at turnover it'll pop up. So that fish was holed up out here where we didn't have any receivers, and then immediately right at turnover, bam, it's right on the near shore. Yeah, so you can just watch how these 2 individual fish just react. And there's fish 2. There's our large movements. Big movements happening in short periods of time. And then you notice fish number 1, the bluefish, ends up here in Buffalo. And fish number 2 at spawning is still monkeying around. He hasn't decided out what if he's found anything yet. And he ends up off the Sturgeon Point right here with those. But you get to just see, and then spawning, we think, and they go away. Okay, so preliminary findings of this nearshore movement, mainly to the south shore, following fall turnover. Initial large, fast scale movements along the shoreline, and then majority of lake trout actually hole up at spawning time between Dunkirk and Erie, Pennsylvania. So that's awesome. But at the beginning, you said something about reproductive failure. So how are we relating this, what we're seeing here so far, and making the jump over to reproductive failure with this? So let's talk about our historical spawning ground here for just a second, and that's Brockton Shoal. So here's Dunkirk, right here, sort of the southwest of that is Brockton Shoal. This is 45 to 60 feet deep out there. This is, I'm sure that there were lots of lake trout spawning areas in the East Basin. The fish were extirpated before we knew a lot about them. However, this was a spot that at spawning time, the commercial fisheries used to exist in the lake. So we know that this was a spawning area with that in the lake. This is the habitat there. 1987, pre-Dracaenads. This is post-Dracaenads, actually 2009, of a very similar sites to those. So what you see here is lakes that are covered in, not only covered still in quagga mussels in the lake, but interstitial spaces totally packed in with pseudofeces and detritus and sand that has got caught up in there, and really no spaces left for lake trout there. We've done surveys out there. We catch no lake trout out on these areas anymore. At spawning time, they're not there. So why is this nearshore area right here so attractive? Well, it's so attractive because this is what the habitat looks like in 20 feet of water, 15 feet of water. It's actually clean rock. And that's what the lake trout are looking for, is clean rock. The problem with that is this is also where our westerlies blow in during that time of the year, and these areas are extremely violent. We lose gear here every year, it gets destroyed, or we lose it and it just goes away in these areas. So these are very dynamic areas there, and we think not very conducive for survival of eggs, let alone getting them past that egg stage and up into the fry or adult stage. So, so I'm going to use my 2 wiggle worms here, preliminary and theory. Okay, so that's what this is, a preliminary theory at this point in time, because we are by no means done with this project. But what we think is going on is that historical spawning area is covered in Dracaenads. It's no longer attractive to our lake trout. The nearshore areas between Dunkirk and Erie do have some clean habitat, but extremely violent areas at spawning time or post-spawning, like that. So there is some clean areas that we think are there on the north shore of the lake, but we saw from the video that very few lake trout appear to be going up there and utilizing them. We haven't quite figured out that yet and what's going on with that. So we have a bunch of future work stuff which we started to try to pinpoint some of these really specific spawning areas down and come in and conclude exactly what the habitat's like that they're spawning on and maybe decide why. And then we go from there on how we'll proceed forward and if there's anything that we can do or how we can move forward towards lake trout reproduction in Lake Erie and maybe making it successful after 40 years of stocking. So a lot of people to thank in this. I won't go over them, but Jason, who's going to talk next, and Chris Vandergoot ran a bunch of the animations on here. So thank you very much for that. That's stuff is very difficult. So with that, I will take any questions if there's time.